The first thing you need to understand is that some truths were never meant to surface. There are whispers buried so deep, in places where the sun never reaches, that even the wind refuses to carry them. Burke County, Georgia, 1838, a place of fertile cotton fields and pristine plantation mansions. Yet beneath the surface, a rot was festering. Willowband Plantation was a masterpiece of white columns and red brick, but appearances were a lie. It was not wealth or status that defined this place. It was secrecy. And in that secrecy lived Cordelia Ruddle, a woman whose command over life and death was absolute, who held dominion over men as easily as a general wields soldiers in formation. Thomas Ruddle's death was the first key, turning the lock on a hidden world. It seemed ordinary enough to outsiders. A wealthy man succumbs to illness. Doctors note acute gastric fever. Neighbors nod in solemn approval, and the funeral proceeds with all expected ritual. But in reality, the death of Thomas was not just a death. It was the initiation of a ritual. The first thread pulled in a tapestry so twisted that generations would tremble at its revelation. Cordelia's composure that morning was not grief, it was calculation. Every movement, every word was measured. The candles burned low, the servants followed her silently, and she carried within her a bundle of instruments, tools for a practice older than the county itself. Tools that manipulated blood, obedience, and the very essence of manhood. The three men chosen, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, were no ordinary slaves. They were skilled, literate in secret ways, and physically marked by a crescent-shaped birthmark that somehow mattered to Cordelia. This was no accident. Their lives were already owned, but she sought not just ownership, she sought transformation. The morning of the first ritual was cold, fog clinging to the edges of Turkey Creek. The world seemed paused, waiting. Cordelia's gray eyes scanned the water and the mist, calculating, observing, commanding. There was a silence in that moment so heavy, it pressed against the chest like stone. The men stepped forward, unaware that once they entered the creek with her, the very structure of their minds and bodies would begin to shift. What she did next would redefine obedience. She did not speak as a mistress. She spoke as a force beyond morality, beyond law, beyond comprehension. And as she read from her leather-bound book, reciting a language neither Latin nor any known tongue, she unlocked something, a ritual that would not merely control the body, but seep into the soul. Imagine standing there, frozen, watching authority so absolute that it eclipses fear itself. This was Cordelia Ruddle at Willowbond, where history's most disturbing secrets were not only lived, but meticulously orchestrated. By the time the morning fog lifted, the first transformation had begun. And the world, as Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah knew, it had already ended. The second morning arrived with the same chill, the same creeping fog over Turkey Creek, yet nothing was ordinary anymore. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah felt it in their bones, a weight, unseen but unrelenting, pressing against their very consciousness. They obeyed without question, though obedience had become instinct, not choice. Cordelia stood at the center, her form pale against the dim dawn light, her eyes cutting through the mist as though seeing every hidden corner of their minds. She carried no anger, no cruelty in the conventional sense. Her power was far subtler, more terrifying. It was the power of inevitability. She instructed them wordlessly at first, allowing the water, the cold, and the silence to speak. Then her voice emerged, calm, deliberate, but with an authority that made their hearts tighten, as if she could squeeze life itself out of hesitation. Every movement was ritualized. She began with Isaiah, guiding him through the water, applying the strange liquids she had prepared, reciting from her mysterious book. The chemicals stung against the skin, but that was only the beginning. Each man's body became a canvas for her precise, measured acts. Blood mixed with water, symbols drawn across shoulders, the crescent marks activated in a way that they could neither understand nor resist. And then came the silence, the real weapon. As the men stood encircled by her, the world outside the creek seemed to vanish. No wind, No birds, no sound of distant hounds. Only her voice, only her presence, only the weight of what they were becoming. It was a control that penetrated deeper than fear. It was ownership of thought, of perception, of identity itself. Every heartbeat aligned with her cadence. Every breath measured against her intent. She was not teaching obedience. She was extracting it from the marrow of their being. By the time the ritual ended, they returned to their duties changed. Subtle at first, the fog in their eyes, the muted energy, the hesitation in initiative but profound. A man's spark, once ignited by freedom, now flickered uncertainly under her influence. And the plantation itself began to feel different, alive in ways they could not articulate. Shadows lingered longer, the trees whispered of secrets, the water reflected truths too dangerous to speak. The rhythm of life at Willowbond was no longer dictated by the sun or the seasons it followed her will. This was the beginning of a system, psychological control, so precise that even the most skilled men could not discern where coercion ended and transformation began. Cordelia Ruddled was not merely exercising power, she was rewriting the rules of the mind, embedding obedience into every fiber, using ritual, water, blood, and words. By now, any resistance had become inconceivable. Their humanity, their perception of freedom, was already being sculpted into something unrecognizable, something that served her legacy in silence. And as you watch this, you must ask yourself, if such influence can shape men in 1838 Georgia, what forces shape us today, unseen, unquestioned, manipulating obedience without ever showing a hand? By the third morning, something irreversible had begun. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah no longer moved with hesitation, they moved with the weight of inevitability pressing down on every muscle, every thought. The water of Turkey Creek no longer felt like a river, but a threshold. A liminal space where the ordinary laws of life and obedience no longer applied. Cordelia Ruddled had transformed it into her own dominion, and stepping into it was stepping into her reality, not their own. Each act she performed was precise, deliberate, and loaded with intention. Every drop of water, every stroke across their shoulders, every whispered word from her leather-bound book had a purpose: to fracture identity and reconstruct it under her absolute authority. She spoke of bloodlines, of traits persisting across generations, and though the language was foreign, the meaning sank directly into their bodies. They understood not consciously, not rationally, but in the marrow of their bones that something had shifted, that a force beyond fear, beyond pain, had claimed them. Cordelia did not merely command, they obeyed because resistance had become impossible. She was a master of hidden systems, of the invisible strings that govern thought, subtly bending will without breaking form. And this mastery was dangerous. Not for her, but for anyone who would discover it, for anyone who might attempt to resist it. The ritual itself began to expand. New elements emerged, different liquids, small cuts over the crescent-shaped birthmarks, patterns repeated in silence. Each session was longer, more meticulous, more immersive. They stood in the cold dawn, shivering, yet nothing could break the invisible grip she held on their minds. Her presence penetrated the spaces they once called private. Dreams began to carry fragments of the ritual, the memory of the water, her gaze, the unrelenting rhythm of her voice. Even their waking thoughts bore traces of her designs. By the end of the third day, the three men were no longer simply enslaved. They were transformed into instruments of her will, living conduits of her secret knowledge. Outside, the plantation remained pristine. To the casual observer, everything was normal. Cotton fields meticulously tended, chores completed efficiently, the house running like clockwork. But inside the minds of these men, a subtle fog had taken root. It clouded judgment, dulled initiative, and instilled a strange reverence for the mistress who had become more than human in their perception. And this is the true danger of hidden power, the way it infiltrates not just actions, but the very perception of reality. Once control enters the mind unseen, it becomes indistinguishable from life itself. And now, pause for a moment and consider. How many forces in your own life shape your choices without ever being seen? How many rituals, subtle or overt, have already claimed your obedience? Comment below with the phrase "I see the unseen" and repeat it again, because this is the moment you recognize the hidden currents around you and commit yourself to awareness. By the fourth dawn, the ritual was no longer simply a routine. It had become a crucible. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah felt themselves unmoored, drifting within the precise orbit of Cordelia's will. Their muscles obeyed before their minds registered, their thoughts bending around invisible boundaries she had drawn. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a stage, a cathedral of obedience, and every movement, every ritualized touch, became part of an unspoken covenant. Cordelia's eyes scanned them, gray and unyielding, as if she could read not only their present but every decision they had ever made or would make. To be in her presence was to confront inevitability itself, and inevitability always wins. She intensified the ritual that morning. The liquids changed the scent of chemicals, herbs, and blood hanging heavy in the fog in each application was coupled with a phrase, precise and untranslatable, that seemed to inscribe something permanent into their minds. The small cuts over the crescent-shaped marks burned, and yet pain had become secondary. Their perception of themselves had already shifted. The fear that once could have restrained them now existed only as a faint echo, drowned beneath the weight of her authority. By now, their obedience was total, but it was not blind. It was intimate. A merging of their will with hers, a transformation as complete as it was terrifying. In the weeks that followed, the change deepened. Outside the ritual, the three men moved through the plantation differently. Their eyes, once bright with intelligence and alertness, now carried a distant glaze, a fogged awareness that made them efficient, yet eerily detached. They worked as if guided by some hidden algorithm, a design beyond human comprehension, and in their minds, the ritual's echo never fully left. Even in sleep, images of water, blood, and the rhythmic cadence of Cordelia's voice haunted them. Willowbond Plantation was no longer just a home or a workplace. It had become an incubator for obedience, for shaping men into conduits of her will. Cordelia herself remained outwardly composed, hosting dinners, managing household inventories, maintaining appearances of propriety. But the truth, the dangerous, invisible truth, was growing in strength beneath her calm. She had discovered something ancient, a method, a pattern, a system of influence that could bend flesh and thought alike. And she wielded it without hesitation, without guilt. Because to her, the ritual was not a crime, it was science. It was power. It was inevitability. Consider this, viewer. Systems of control exist in every era, every society, every hierarchy. Most of them are invisible, unspoken. And just as Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah became instruments of Cordelia's hidden agenda, so too do unseen forces shape choices and beliefs today. Reflect on that. By the fifth morning, the transformation was unmistakable. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah no longer carried the same spark of defiance, the same subtle assertion of self. Even the smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, a glance, a breath taken without instruction, had been subdued. Cordelia Ruddle's presence had become an anchor for their very existence, gravitational force bending thought, perception, and memory itself. The ritual at Turkey Creek had become more than a morning act. It was the axis upon which their lives now turned, a sequence of events they both obeyed and feared and yet could not resist. She stood at the center as the fog rolled over the water, her gray eyes unblinking. The liquids, the cuts, the words, they were no longer random. Each action corresponded to a specific purpose, a hidden algorithm designed to strip away not just autonomy, but identity. They followed her instructions automatically, each movement precise. Like dancers in a choreography, they could neither question nor alter. Blood mixed with water, words hung in the mist, and something invisible, something psychological, began to seep into the spaces between thought. They were no longer men acting under compulsion. They were extensions of her will, instruments of a knowledge too dark to name. Outside the creek, the plantation appeared unchanged. Visitors, neighbors, even the local clergy saw only a well-managed estate, the epitome of Southern propriety. But the eyes that once reflected subtle defiance now mirrored obedience and fear so deep it could not be articulated. Their minds carried echoes of the ritual, memories of water, the rhythm of her voice, the pattern of liquid, cuts, and phrases. Even in silence, even in sleep, Cordelia's influence persisted. She had mastered a system of control so complete that resistance was impossible because they had forgotten what it meant to resist. And yet, there was more than mere domination at play. Cordelia's actions were deliberate, precise, and informed by knowledge far beyond local understanding. Her journals, letters from unnamed contacts in Charleston and Europe, and the preparation of exotic compounds revealed that she was not merely a mistress of the house. She was a manipulator of hidden forces, of psychological codes that had existed whispered across generations. The three men had become unwilling vessels of her experiments. Their obedience a secret science enacted at dawn in the misted water of Turkey Creek. Pause here for a moment and reflect. True control is invisible. The most powerful forces are those that shape thought before action, perception before choice. Comment below with the phrase, "I see the unseen," and repeat it once more because recognizing the hidden systems around you is the first step toward awakening. The first step toward reclaiming autonomy from forces you have never suspected. By the sixth morning, something had irrevocably changed. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah no longer simply obeyed, they anticipated her will, as though the ritual had rewired the architecture of their minds. The cold water of Turkey Creek was no longer just a river. It was a crucible, a mirror reflecting a reality that only Cordelia controlled. The fog rolling across the surface seemed to obey her presence, curling and shifting like sentient mist around the three men, isolating them from thought, from memory, from themselves. Each word she uttered, each motion she performed, etched deeper into their consciousness, shaping them into living instruments of a secret science, too dangerous to be named aloud. Cordelia's gray eyes pierced through the veil of the morning. She moved with precision, her hands conducting rituals that blended alchemy, medicine, and psychology. The liquids she poured, the blood she marked, the phrases she recited, all were elements of a system she had spent years perfecting. It was not cruelty in the conventional sense that ruled here. This was control distilled to its purest form, a force capable of bending thought, memory, and even perception, without a single lash, without a word of threat. By now, the men felt the weight of her presence even before entering the creek. The anticipation of ritual had replaced independent thought. Fear had become ritualized. Obedience had become instinct. Outside the water, life continued, as if nothing had changed. The cotton fields remained immaculate. The house ran with the efficiency of a clock. The neighbors saw only prosperity and order. But inside, the plantation was alive with invisible forces. The three men moved through tasks mechanically, their eyes glazed, their expressions hollow, yet attentive. Each carried an echo of the ritual, an imprint of control that shadowed every waking moment. The transformation was subtle, invisible to outsiders, but devastating in its precision. By the time dawn passed, they were no longer the men who had stepped into the creek. Their bodies and minds had been rewritten, a secret history written into flesh, blood, and memory. Cordelia herself remained outwardly composed, hosting guests, managing her household, and maintaining the image of the Southern plantation mistress. Yet behind her calm facade, she held dangerous knowledge, the blueprint of obedience. The formula for subverting human will, the method to claim absolute dominion over body and soul. She was not merely a woman of privilege, she was a practitioner of forbidden arts, an architect of hidden agendas that no law, no clergy, no moral convention could touch. As you absorb this, consider what you take for granted. How many forces around you shape thought, behavior, and perception without your awareness? How many rituals, systems, and manipulations are quietly reshaping your choices? This is the dangerous knowledge you were never supposed to see. By the seventh dawn, the ritual had grown beyond the physical. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were no longer merely participants. They had become conduits. Vessels through which Cordelia extended her will. Their minds, once separate and distinct, now bore subtle traces of her design. Thoughts they believed their own flickered only as shadows behind the architecture of control she had imposed. The creek, the fog, the cold water, all were instruments of transformation. And each repetition of the ritual deepened the bond, entwined them with forces they did not understand and could not resist. Cordelia's presence was a law unto itself. She moved with deliberate calm, her gray eyes measuring, calculating, knowing everything before a word was spoken. The liquids, the precise cuts over the crescent-shaped marks. The whispered phrases from her leather-bound book, each was part of a hidden formula. It's a psychological blueprint perfected over years. This was no ordinary manipulation. It was a system designed to claim loyalty, fear, and obedience simultaneously. And it worked because it was invisible. The three men could not fight it, they could not even see it. Resistance was not only impossible, it was unthinkable. Outside the creek, the plantation continued its facade of normalcy. Guests saw only elegance, neighbors only propriety. But the quiet observers would never understand what truly governed Willowbon. The work of the fields, the routines of the house, even the flow of conversation had been infiltrated by her design. Each man acted as though free, but their minds had been subtly rewritten, their initiative replaced by programmed compliance. Their identities were fading, replaced with the echo of a ritual whose depth extended beyond their comprehension. The psychological consequences were immediate and profound. Isaiah, once sharp and independent, now hesitated where he had once acted decisively. Caleb, whose physical prowess was unmatched, moved with precise efficiency, yet without the spark that had made him exceptional. Josiah, the youngest, carried a hollow weight in his eyes, a sense of distance from himself that grew daily. The ritual did not merely dominate them, it changed them, carving obedience into the core of their being. Consider this and hear it carefully. Power is rarely displayed with violence. The most dangerous forces are subtle, hidden, invisible. They bend perception, they manipulate desire, they restructure thought, and when wielded by someone like Cordelia Ruddled, that power becomes absolute. Even now, as you listen, think about the invisible systems around you, the forces shaping behavior, perception, and belief without your awareness. By the eighth morning, the ritual had become a force unto itself. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah no longer entered the creek as men, they entered as extensions of Cordelia Ruddled's will, moving with a precision that was both unnatural and terrifying. Their bodies responded automatically, their minds trapped in a web of obedience they could not even perceive. The fog clung to them like a second skin, thickening the air with a weight that pressed on every thought. They stood in the cold water, shivering, yet every tremor had purpose. Every movement was accounted for. Every reaction had been anticipated. Cordelia's gray eyes scanned the three men, not with cruelty, but with the calm certainty of someone who had mastered something older, darker, and more absolute than fear. She spoke in a language no one recognized, her voice steady, rhythmic, carrying instructions that shaped thought and memory as effectively as any law or whip. The liquids, the cuts, the precise gesture, they were not mere actions. They were instruments of psychological engineering, an invisible architecture that carved obedience into their consciousness. Resistance was meaningless. It had been stripped away at the very roots of their being. Outside, Willowbon Plantation remained immaculate, an unbroken facade of civility. The house ran like a clock, the fields maintained with silent precision, and neighbors saw only order and refinement. Yet inside, the invisible strings that governed the men were tightening. Their identities were fading, replaced by the echo of the ritual and the omnipresent awareness of her control. Dreams carried fragments of water, of blood, of chance from the leather-bound book. Thoughts were interrupted by memories of the creek, Each man's perception of reality had been subtly but irrevocably rewired. This was more than domination. It was corruption of self, an erasure of autonomy, a transformation so complete that even memory no longer felt like their own. The ritual's repetition had embedded obedience into their subconscious. Their minds were no longer safe sanctuaries. They had become territories claimed by another. And yet, Cordelia maintained a calm outward composure, as though nothing had changed. While in truth, she had orchestrated a system of control that most rulers and conquerors could only dream of achieving. Now, pause and reflect. True power is often invisible. The most dangerous forces are those that shape thought before action, perception before choice. They bend identity, silence doubt, and enforce loyalty without violence. As you watch and listen, consider the systems in your own life, the subtle currents shaping your decisions without your notice. Comment now with the phrase, "I see the unseen," and repeat it once more to anchor your awareness and recognize the forces that operate in silence. Just as Cordelia's ritual reshaped the minds of 3 men at Willowbond Plantation, by the 9th morning, the changes were undeniable. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were no longer men in any meaningful sense. They were vessels. Shadows of their former selves, walking embodiments of Cordelia Ruddle's design. Every thought, every action, every instinct had been subtly rewritten. The creek, the fog, the cold water, all had become instruments of a slow, inexorable corruption. They obeyed not out of fear, nor even loyalty, but because resistance had been erased from the architecture of their minds. What remained of their independence flickered weakly, like a candle struggling against a hurricane. Cordelia moved among them with absolute authority. Her eyes, pale and calculating, seemed to pierce not just flesh but spirit. She applied her rituals with precision, mixing liquids that stung and burned, marking their crescent-shaped birthmarks with deliberate intent, and chanting words that had no immediate meaning but etched themselves into the very wiring of their minds. Her control was invisible yet total. The men could not question her, could not resist her, and could not even recall a time when they were not bound to her will. Every repetition strengthened the ritual, embedding obedience, dulling initiative, and cementing a quiet terror that would last their entire lives. The plantation itself was complicit in silence. 2 neighbors, Willowbond remained the epitome of southern civility, beautiful lawns, immaculate fields, and perfectly timed routines. But beneath the surface, a hidden system governed every action. The 3 men worked tirelessly, efficiently, yet without spark or independence. Their eyes, once alert and intelligent, now carried the glazed emptiness of those who had surrendered something essential, something invisible, yet vital. Cordelia had not only transformed them, she had extracted the very essence of who they were and replaced it with a controlled, functional mimicry of life. This is the terrifying part. The truth rarely acknowledged. Real power often leaves no visible scars. True domination reshapes identity, rewires perception, and hijacks reality itself. Cordelia had discovered an ancient method, science of obedience and psychological control that transcended conventional morality, law, and human understanding. And she wielded it with a calm inevitability, as if she were enacting the natural order of the world itself. Now, consider your own reality. How many forces operate silently around you, subtly bending decisions, thoughts, and beliefs without your knowledge? How many unseen rituals govern your behavior? The lesson is chilling and simple. The greatest power is invisible. The deepest corruption is subtle, and the most dangerous truths are those that remain hidden, shaping life from the shadows. By the 10th dawn, Willowbond Plantation had become a theater of secrets, a hidden world operating on rules unknown to the outside. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah had long since ceased to be fully themselves. They moved, spoke, and even thought under the invisible weight of Cordelia Ruddle's command. Obedience had become instinct, identity had been reshaped, and the spark that once defined them flickered like a distant memory, impossible to grasp. The ritual was no longer an act, they had become its permanent instruments, each repetition layering more control, more influence, more transformation. Cordelia, ever calm, ever precise, orchestrated it all with the air of inevitability. Her gray eyes, unblinking and unwavering, seemed to measure not just bodies, but souls. Each drop of water, each cut across the crescent-shaped birthmarks, each whispered word from the leather-bound book carried the weight of invisible authority. She had discovered something older than the county. Older than the laws of men, a method for bending not just flesh, but consciousness. A system that turned free will into silent obedience. A pattern that could remake men without the world ever noticing. And in doing so, she had claimed a dominion more absolute than any earthly power. The consequences were profound. Isaiah, once confident and independent, now moved through tasks with flawless efficiency, but no spark of initiative. Caleb, the strongest of the three, worked tirelessly yet without curiosity. Without thought, a perfect instrument of the hidden design. Josiah, the youngest, carried a quiet horror in his eyes. A lingering awareness that he had been claimed by something beyond understanding, a silent terror woven into his very being. The plantation itself seemed alive with the rhythm of control, the invisible architecture of obedience, the hidden current that dictated every action, every choice, every breath. To witness this, to truly grasp it, is to recognize that power often wears no mask. The most dangerous forces operate silently, shaping thought, perception, and behavior before you can resist. Cordelia's rituals were a study in invisible dominion. A blueprint for control that few could imagine, and even fewer would dare to confront. The truth is simple and terrifying. Once influence penetrates the mind unseen, resistance becomes impossible, and identity itself becomes fluid, subject to the will of those who understand the hidden rules. Now, as you absorb this story, reflect on your own life. Where do unseen forces shape your decisions? Which systems operate silently, bending behavior, perception, and thought without your knowledge? If you have truly seen what lies beneath the surface, comment below with "I see the unseen" and repeat it again. Anchor this awareness. Because the moment you recognize hidden currents is the moment you awaken to the forces that shape reality. And that is the dangerous knowledge that changes everything.